Okay, so in this penultimate video for the tracker sled, we're actually going to look at things the tracker sled is already really well developed for. So in investigating the tracker sled and in developing it, we've taken what Google refers to as a monkey first policy, which they say if you're going to teach a monkey to recite Shakespeare on a pedestal, you start first by training the monkey, not working on the pedestal. So likewise, we've attempted to do and to attack the really difficult parts of this problem and not the easy ones. So as you'll see, these last two videos are things that the tracker sled does very, very well with very little effort. So what we're going to talk about today is a regenerative ag concept, which is actually integrating livestock into crop production and into the agricultural world, the sort of regenerative world. And it's largely because the animals can provide these ecosystem services that most people don't think about. When you think about, say, CAFOs in the United States and how much waste they produce and how much water and how inefficient they are, that's accurate. So this has led to an understanding that's known as it's not the cow, it's the how, meaning that if animals are raised in a way that they align with nature and replicate the ecosystems that they evolved in, it can make a lot of sense for everybody. So that's what we're going to talk about now, is how you could integrate animals. For our purpose, we're demonstrating this with beef cattle, but clearly this could be sheep, goats, other livestock. In fact, many regenerative farmers talk about the livestock they maintain above the ground and the other livestock, meaning the microbes that they maintain below the ground. So we're going to look at a type of grazing here that's really built in to the tracker sled model. And it's known in the United States as high density grazing. And it's meant to replicate what the actions of ruminants on the prairies of the United States before European settlers destroyed that ecosystem. Ironically, in the name of agriculture. But what we're talking about is animals staying in close herds that move frequently, so that they eat together as a defensive group and then move on. Alan Savory is a South African that developed this idea of improving the efficiency of grazing by increasing the stock density on a piece of land. So in the United States, we call this rotational grazing. When it gets to high density grazing, it really refers to densities where you have 100,000 pounds of animals on 1 acre per day. So what we're going to demonstrate here is a couple different things with the tracker sled. So we just, instead of having all 5 sleds here, we're just doing a portion of this to demonstrate. The array of 59 trains of tracker sleds make 58 paddocks that animals can graze in. If I was to say the most modest density of high density grazing, it would be 14 animals, say they are 1,000 pound cows that are in this 25-foot by 250-foot long paddock. And that refers to the area that the animals can graze, typically in a single day. And then the farmer would move them to the next paddock. So this is an example of what those 14 animals look like in scale here. In this next iteration here, it's double the density, so we have at least 28 animals here, doubling that density. Now there are grazers that will actually even double those number of animals. Sometimes, of course, you have to move them more frequently than a day. But this is what we're calling sort of the simple row, which we've envisioned to this point, where you line all 59 tracker sleds up on 12 acres. So there's one more option here that the tracker sled, if it's used for grazing in rangeland, can afford the farmer. And that's what we're going to call a checkerboard arrangement, where instead of arranging the sleds in rows on one side of a common drive aisle, and again, this is where I have my infrastructure, I can alternate them, right? And then when I move these sleds, right, I can move them just to the other side. So they are almost sort of intertwined or interlaced. And what this would afford a rancher is a much wider and still long paddock. Actually, the aspect ratio of the rows here are pretty good for grazing. This type of grazing is also called mob grazing. That comes from the European term for herd, largely a mob. But this high density grazing, this mob grazing, these long, thin paddocks work really well because the animals tend to move back and forth, so that you get not only the animals' manure, which is part of the ecosystem, returning carbon and nutrients to the soil, but the animals themselves both eat the plants. They can't eat the plants to a depth where they threaten their vitality, right? And then you also get the sort of trampling action of the animal's hooves on the ground. And this actually is good for the entire ecosystem, provided the paddock has enough time to recover. So again, with 59 tracker sleds in 12 acres, we have 58 paddocks, right? So if you use them in series, by the time you rotate all the way back to that original paddock, you'll have 58 days of recovery, which is very excellent because you'd have a minimum of 45 days of recovery typically. But if you do this checkerboard arrangement, you get a much wider, broader paddock, still maintaining those number of paddocks you need for rotation. But in this case, you can then move, add an additional 10 animals here and have much larger groupings. Say, in this case, 43 animals in a single paddock. So again, there's not a whole lot we need to invent, innovate. This is a system, it's here for the taking. It's just what the tracker sled is really well adapted for. Ranchers now that erect electric fences around their herds so they can rotationally graze, we already have the built-in fences. And all they have to do is close the open end, two open ends, and provide water to have a fully functional paddock for the rotational grazing program.